For centuries, it was a brutal, unshakable tradition. In Taiwan, like in much of the regions, the practice of foot binding subjected countless women to a lifetime of pain and confinement, all for an aesthetic ideal. Reformers condemned it, the Japanese colonial government tried to discourage it, but for generations the custom held on with a stubborn grip. So what finally delivered one of the most powerful blows against this deeply entrenched practice? Was it an enlightened social movement? A wave of feminist awakening? A government crackdown? The historical record points to something far more unexpected. Sugarcane. As the demand for sugar surged, the economic value of farming had exploded. Suddenly, the labor of every person, man or woman, became a critical asset. A family simply couldn't afford to have its women crippled and unable to work in the fields. The economic logic became undeniable. The profit from a harvest began to outweigh the cultural pressure of tradition. Money, it turned out, was a more effective liberator than moral arguments. This strange, direct link between a cash crop and the liberation of women's feet is a stark reminder that the real forces shaping history are often not what we think. It makes you question what other official stories might be missing the point. And it's at the heart of Taiwan's so-called economic miracle, a story that, it turns out, we might not know nearly as well as we believe. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're embarking on a truly fascinating journey, digging into Taiwan's economic and social development. And it's a narrative that's far richer, far more surprising, I think, than the conventional accounts you might have run into.
Yeah, definitely.
We're aiming to challenge those, well-worn tropes, the simple economic miracle story, or, on the other hand, just colonial exploitation. We want to uncover the really intricate dance of economics, social transformation, and international relations that truly shaped this remarkable island. Our deep dive will take us right from the Japanese colonial period, which is a really complex era in itself, all the way through the, tumultuous post-World War II era under the Kuomintang, the KMT, the Nationalist Party that had fled mainland China.
And this exploration, I think it will undoubtedly challenge some, let's say, deeply held assumptions you might have about historical causality, about what really drives change.
Right.
We're going to reveal how these distinct eras, ranging from that colonial administration to massive post-war international aid, didn't just influence Taiwan. They fundamentally reshaped it, and often in profound and, frankly, counterintuitive ways.
Yeah. Our goal really is to move beyond those simplistic single-cause explanations. We want to highlight the multifaceted nature of historical change. We'll guide you through specific, really compelling examples showing how underlying economic incentives and, monumental geopolitical shifts prove to be far more powerful catalysts than many traditional histories might lead you to believe.
That opening about sugarcane and foot binding, it really sticks with you, doesn't it?
It really does.
The idea that a cash crop, something as seemingly mundane as sugarcane, could be a more powerful force against a deeply entrenched cultural tradition like foot binding than, deliberate social movements or government decrees. It genuinely compels us to rethink how history actually works.
Are you suggesting that purely economic forces can sometimes be more potent than deliberate social reforms or political will, even in areas as personal as women's rights? Absolutely. And this specific example from the Japanese colonial period in Taiwan, it isn't just some isolated anecdote. It offers a profound, I'd say revised perspective on how economic incentives can drive comprehensive socioeconomic transformations. And that includes very significant improvements in women's status. It forces us to consider the quiet, almost relentless logic of the marketplace. When economic realities start to redefine human value, they can erode centuries-old traditions much faster, perhaps, than any moral crusade or legislative decree. It's a pragmatic, almost brutal kind of liberation, you could say, where the value of a woman's labor in the fields quite literally began to outweigh the perceived cultural beauty of, crippled feet. This isn't just a quirky historical footnote. It's a powerful window into how societies truly transform, often through forces we rarely acknowledge.
That's a powerful and, somewhat sobering thought. It made me try to imagine the real-life implications. Thinking about the unintended social consequences of that Japanese-era sugarcane economy. It got me picturing a young girl in a rural Taiwanese village, maybe in the 1920s. Let's call her May.
Okay.
Her grandmother, she'd endured the agony of foot binding. Her tiny, deformed lotus feet, they were a symbol of status, but tragically they rendered her almost immobile, totally dependent on others.
Right. A terrible price.
And May's own mother also had bound feet, though maybe less severely. For generations, this was just the accepted way, right? Woven into the fabric of their lives. But then, as the demand for sugarcane surged globally, the fields around May's village began to require more and more labor, especially for those intricate, tedious tasks like weeding the rows and harvesting the leaves.
Right, tasks that women could do well.
Exactly. These were jobs that women and older children with their nimble fingers and maybe lower stature could do particularly well. So for the first time, there was this consistent growing opportunity for women in her village to earn a direct cash wage, however small it might have been initially.
Okay.
So May would see the slightly older girls, the ones whose feet hadn't been bound, moving quickly, efficiently through the rows. Their unbound feet allowed them to cover more ground, earn more for their families. They could walk unassisted to the market miles away sometimes. Their small income granted them this tiny yet really significant sliver of independence.
A tangible difference.
Yeah. So when the time came, as tradition dictated, for May's own feet to be bound, her father, probably a practical man just struggling to make ends meet, he looks at his family's meager accounts. He looks at the obvious productivity of the unbound girls working in the fields nearby. And he hesitates.
The calculation changes.
Exactly. The cold, hard economic logic of having a mobile, productive daughter started to really compete with centuries of cultural pressure and aesthetic ideals. The thought of losing May's potential earning power, however small, became a tangible daily concern. It started shifting the balance right there in their household.
May's story, though maybe hypothetical in the specifics, it isn't just illustrative. It's a stark portrayal of that economic logic at its most effective. The massive surge in demand for sugarcane meant an ever-increasing need for field labor, particularly for tasks like weeding, which needs significant mobility, and harvesting leaves.
Right.
These were jobs that women and children could not only effectively perform, but also gain real expertise in.
Yeah.
So this created a direct, undeniable link between a woman's physical mobility and her family's economic survival, maybe even prosperity.
It makes perfect sense when you put it that way.
Suddenly, a woman's ability to move freely, to work productively in the fields, it translated directly into tangible cash income for her family. This new practical value system, where a woman's physical productivity was a critical, measurable asset, began to directly challenge and ultimately erode those centuries-old cultural pressures of beauty and status associated with bound feet. The economic imperative, driven by a global cash crop, literally began to outweigh the cultural ideal. It's economics driving social change in a very direct way.
That's a profound shift. So what does this all mean for the wider picture of women's status during this time? Was it solely about the physical act of unbinding feet, or did these economic shifts create other, maybe more far-reaching ripples throughout Taiwanese society?
Oh, it absolutely went beyond just the physical act of unbinding feet.
Yeah.
This economic imperative, born from the sugarcane boom, led to broader improvements in women's standing within their communities and families.
Really? Like what?
Remarkably, historical data suggests it even contributed to a reduction in female disappearance rates, things like female infanticide or neglect.
Wow.
When women's labor had an undeniable measurable economic value, their overall worth and agency within the household and community significantly increased. They weren't just, perceived as economic burdens or symbols of status anymore. They were active, vital contributors to the household income.
So they gained leverage, essentially.
Exactly. This wasn't merely a top-down social movement initiated by reformers or some decree from colonial authorities. It was a grassroots transformation, really driven by the very practical economic realities faced by families across Taiwan. Women became indispensable contributors to the household economy, and that shift in perceived value had widespread implications for their autonomy, their negotiation power within the family, even their long-term security.
It's fascinating how a global market for a single crop can have such an intimate, personal effect on social customs and family dynamics, which I guess brings us to a broader point. We often think of colonial rule purely in terms of exploitation.
Which it certainly involved.
Absolutely, and that's a valid perspective for many regions. But the Japanese administration in Taiwan, it seems, also laid significant foundations for modern economic development, things that continued to benefit the island long after they left. This makes the legacy incredibly complex, doesn't it?
This is where we connect this to the bigger picture, and it's a crucial nuance. Japanese colonial rule in Taiwan, spanning from 1895 to 1945, undeniably initiated the island's journey towards a modern capitalist economy. It's absolutely crucial to acknowledge the dual nature of colonialism in this specific context.
Right, not just black or white.
Exactly. While there was clear extraction of resources and labor, there was also undeniable long-term development. Japan, being a relatively late imperialist power compared to, say, Britain or France, adopted what some historians have termed a high-cost and high-yield approach in Taiwan.
High cost, high yield. What does that mean exactly?
It means they pursued extensive economic growth programs, making substantial investments in infrastructure and institutions before fully extracting the proceeds. They essentially viewed Taiwan as a model colony, something to showcase their imperial capabilities and also to serve their own strategic economic needs back home. They needed it to be productive.
And when you talk about those investments, we're not just talking small projects, are we? I mean, think about the sheer scale of what they built. Extensive networks of roads, railways, deep water ports, and these massive transformative irrigation systems.
Huge projects.
These weren't just about moving resources out, were they? They fundamentally changed the physical landscape of daily life for ordinary Taiwanese people, created a modern infrastructure that simply hadn't existed before. It sounds like a complete overhaul.
It really was a complete overhaul and meticulously planned over decades. The first colonial decade, for instance, heavily focused on establishing order and marketizing the economy. That involved building and expanding transportation networks, roads, railways to move goods more efficiently. Simultaneously, they conducted these incredibly comprehensive cadastral surveys across the entire island.
Land surveys, right. Why were those so important?
Well, they weren't just administrative tasks. They had a dual purpose. Boosting tax revenue, obviously, by accurately assessing land values and ownership, but also, crucially, clarifying property rights. This made land transactions more secure, more modern, and really facilitated more dynamic market economy.
I see, so it greased the wheels of commerce.
Precisely. Then, the second decade saw the addition of periodic censuses. These were used to meticulously monitor the labor supply, vital for agricultural and industrial planning, and also to improve household registration systems. Alongside this, they undertook natural resource surveys to verify public ownership of key resources, like forests or minerals.
Which they could then license out.
Exactly. Licensed strategically to Japanese capitalists for exploitation. Then, by the third and fourth decades, the focus shifted to even larger scale projects. Major irrigation and electrical power systems were installed. These were specifically designed to dramatically enhance agricultural productivity, think Reddix, rice, sugar, and also to spark some initial industrialization.
And they put serious money into this, didn't they?
They did. It's particularly noteworthy that the colonial authority absorbed a significant chunk, about 60% of the cost, for these vital water control and irrigation systems. And by the 1940s, these systems covered an astonishing 2/3 of the cultivated land in Taiwan. These were monumental undertakings that fundamentally altered the island's productive capacity.
It's almost poetic, isn't it? That for generations, farmers were just totally at the mercy of the weather, and then suddenly a colonial power, yes, with its own ambitions, brings this level of control over nature that fundamentally reshapes their entire outlook on life, on planning. I was reading Professor Wu Tsung-min's book, 400 Years of Taiwan's Economy, and it really challenges so many established narratives. It got me thinking about the real people behind these huge economic shifts. To bring this to life, I tried to imagine some of the stories from these periods.
Yeah, the human element is crucial.
Try to imagine a young man, let's call him Kenji, maybe around 1930, toiling away in the sun-baked plains of southern Taiwan. His family, for generations, they'd been rice farmers. Their entire lives dictated by the whims of the weather, praying desperately for rain, then fearing the devastating floods.
The constant uncertainty.
Exactly. He'd heard his grandfather talk about entire harvests lost to drought, that constant gnawing uncertainty that was just an unavoidable part of their existence. Then, the Japanese administration starts this colossal project nearby the Qian Canal.
A massive undertaking.
For months, he watches strangers with strange equipment. Japanese engineers, Taiwanese laborers, digging tirelessly, redirecting entire rivers, building these massive aqueducts that look like giant centipedes marching across the landscape. There was grumbling, of course, about the disruption, the forced labor sometimes, the colonial authorities' heavy hand.
Understandable resistance.
But Kenji, despite maybe the hardship, also felt a spark of something else. Hope. The year the intricate canal system was finally completed, he stood there with his father, and for the first time in their lives, he opened a sluice gate, watching as clear, cool water flowed steadily into his family's parched fields, even on a dry, cloudless day.
Must have felt like magic.
It felt nothing short of a miracle, I imagine. It wasn't just about the promise of more rice, though that was huge. It was about being able to plan. He could now reliably grow a second crop, maybe that highly profitable sugarcane that was in such demand.
Right, economic diversification.
His family could start to save a little, to think beyond immediate survival, maybe even dream about sending his younger sister for more schooling. The future was no longer just this desperate gamble against the sky. It was something they could actively cultivate, participate in.
Kinchi's story, or stories like it, perfectly encapsulates how this kind of infrastructure, while undeniably serving imperial economic goals like enabling the growth of high-value crops like sugarcane for export back to Japan, simultaneously provided individuals with what really amounted to the foundational brick of a modern, stable life. It transformed farming from this precarious gamble into a much more predictable enterprise. And that fostered a market-based mindset. It laid critical groundwork for future prosperity in a way that abstract policies alone just couldn't achieve. This tangible, practical improvement in daily life created a direct, compelling link between colonial development and individual opportunity. It changed the very psychology of agrarian existence for many.
And beyond just the physical infrastructure, the canals and roads, the Japanese also brought a new level of governance, right? Institutional structures that were largely absent before. This wasn't just about building things. It was about organizing society and the economy in entirely new, more efficient ways. What was the impact of these new institutions?
Oh, the impact was profound and systemic. You see the establishment of modern financial institutions, banks, credit cooperatives starting to spread throughout rural areas from the 1900s onwards.
Getting credit out there.
Exactly. These institutions played a vital role in expanding agricultural production by providing credit, which was often predatory before. They also mobilized savings from a wider population, helped facilitate local commerce, moving away from informal, often exploitative lending practices. Simultaneously, you had organizations like farmers' associations, irrigation associations, and agricultural extension stations being introduced. These weren't just bureaucratic bodies, they were instrumental in disseminating new seed varieties, introducing more advanced farming technologies, and educating farmers on more efficient cultivation techniques.
Spreading knowledge.
Yes. These combined efforts systematically commercialized the agrarian economy, integrating it much more fully into market systems, both domestic and international, though primarily geared towards Japan.
And the state itself became more powerful.
Absolutely. The colonial state itself, meticulously built and largely staffed by expatriates from Japan, became notably effective and, frankly, pervasive. By 1943, for example, there was one police officer for every 8 residents.
Wow, that's incredibly dense.
It's remarkably dense, even compared to other colonies like Korea around the same time. And this robust state capacity wasn't just for maintaining order, though that was key. It was also used for mass mobilization, getting people to work on public facilities construction, and for that extensive agricultural extension work we just discussed. This dense network effectively reached deep into local communities, allowing for centralized planning and implementation on an unprecedented scale.
And it wasn't just about the economy or control either. You mentioned there were also significant investments in social services that presumably had a lasting impact on human capital.
Indeed. Beyond infrastructure and economic institutions, we do observe a considerable expansion of education and marked improvements in public sanitation under Japanese rule.
Like literacy rates.
Exactly. The literacy rate in Taiwan saw a substantial increase. It went from maybe 1% around 1905 to about 27% by 1940. Still not universal, but a huge jump.
That's significant.
And elementary school enrollment figures also rose dramatically, climbing from maybe 8 or 9% in 1905 to over 57% by 1935. These statistics highlight a concerted effort to enhance human capital and public welfare. Now, the primary motivations were often tied to colonial administrative efficiency, creating a more productive workforce for the imperial economy, and the assimilationist goals of the Japanese state, creating loyal subjects. But the effect was still significant development in these areas. They sought to create healthier, more educated subjects capable of contributing to the empire.
These developments sound undeniably impressive, showcasing a real commitment to modernization in certain ways. But this brings us back to that complex legacy. Was Taiwan truly a model colony developed for the benefit of Taiwanese people, or was it primarily a highly efficient tool for Japan's imperial ambitions? That label model colony feels very loaded, doesn't it?
Extremely loaded.
Where do we see the clearest evidence of this imperial extraction at play, even amidst all this development?
This is precisely where the debate over Taiwan as a model colony becomes profoundly nuanced, and it's critical not to view it through a simplistic lens. Taiwan was, first and foremost, undeniably designed to serve as an agrarian base and a captive market for Japanese industrial goods.
The classic colonial model.
Pretty much. Rice and sugar became the leading exports, consistently accounting for around 70% of total exports right up until World War II, and almost all of it was destined exclusively for Japan. Conversely, major imports, things like chemical fertilizers, essential for boosting that agricultural output, textiles, various consumer goods, predominantly came from Japan. It completed this highly controlled economic loop, benefiting the metropole.
So industry didn't really take off.
Industrialization, while present, was severely limited in its scope and its design. It was primarily confined to things like sugar refining and food processing, essentially functioning as an appendix of the primary agricultural sector. It was designed to add some value to Taiwan's raw materials before they were shipped off to Japan.
Not building a local industrial base.
Not really. Even a so-called crash industrialization program in the 1930s, involving industries like chemical fertilizer, textiles, metals, industrial chemicals, that was largely initiated for Japan's own war preparation efforts. And often it just involved relocating used or older facilities from Japan rather than fostering a fundamental self-sustaining transformation of Taiwan's industrial base for its own benefit.
And what about the profits? Did Taiwanese people see the benefits?
Well, despite the elevated income levels, which were, interestingly, about twice that of mainland China on the eve of the Sino-Japanese War, the growth rate of per capita consumption for Taiwanese people actually lagged significantly behind the growth rate of per capita production. Meaning a large chunk of the wealth being generated wasn't staying in the hands of the producers. This disparity points directly to several sophisticated mechanisms of extraction. Things like cartelized sugar production, where prices were controlled by Japanese companies to maximize their profits. Highly organized export systems that minimize the returns for local producers. Tight control over essential input materials, like chemical fertilizers, often sold at inflated prices. And effective, often quite heavy taxation in the rural sector was a defining feature of the Japanese colonial state.
So farmers were squeezed.
Farmers were, in essence, squeezed through various means to support the empire's economic and military objectives. Furthermore, Taiwanese capitalists, local entrepreneurs, found themselves deliberately marginalized within the modern industrial sector. By the mid-1930s, they owned maybe 20% at most of the paid-in capital in joint stock corporations. Japanese capital overwhelmingly dominated.
And management, too.
And management, technical expertise. Japanese personnel accounted for a vast majority of technicians, around 80% in legal corporations and transportation, maybe 74% in trade, and a staggering 92% in commerce. This really underscores the limited opportunities for local entrepreneurial and professional advancement under the colonial system.
So it was a really complex picture then. Significant development, particularly in infrastructure and basic services, running alongside clear exploitation, resource extraction, and severely limited opportunities for local Taiwanese to really climb the economic ladder in the modern sectors. This blend of progress and imperial self-interest really makes the historical narrative challenging to simplify.
Absolutely. It wasn't a straightforward good or bad story. It had elements of both, deeply intertwined.
Let's delve deeper now into the social changes, specifically around education for women during that Japanese colonial period. We've already seen how economic necessity, like with the sugarcane example, pushed against foot binding. But what about formal education? What were the colonial government's intentions, and what was the actual impact of their policies on girls and women in Taiwan?
That's a really important question, because it wasn't a simple unidirectional imposition. How did Japanese educational policies, specifically targeting girls, interact with the existing Taiwanese societal structures, family expectations, and maybe even women's own aspirations? There was this dynamic interplay between the colonial ideals being pushed and the local realities on the ground, and that led to outcomes that were often unintended or reinterpreted by Taiwanese women themselves.
Right. So Japan's explicit goal for its colonies was assimilation, doka, trying to create modern Japanese citizens out of the local populations. And for females, there was that additional, very specific goal, cultivating the ideal of the good wife, wise mother, or Rhea Sekenbo, which was pretty central to defining women's roles in Imperial Japan and its colonies at the time.
That's exactly right. The curriculum designed for girls was heavily weighted towards instilling a Japanese identity and unwavering loyalty to the emperor. Core subjects included the Japanese national language, kokugo, and imperial morals, shushin.
Indoctrination, basically.
You could certainly see it that way. And for women, moral instruction and domestic science were absolutely central to this. The home was conceptualized as the root of the state. That meant that women's private labor within the household, raising children, managing the family, was imbued with significant public meaning. It was seen as directly contributing to the strength and stability of the Japanese nation-state. This ideal was meant to apply to all women across the empire, aiming to assimilate them into a standardized, compliant Japanese womanhood.
But despite this big push for assimilation, the education system itself was highly segregated, wasn't it? It wasn't truly equal opportunity in practice for Taiwanese children, especially for girls.
Precisely. The system maintained clear ethnic segregation, and at higher levels, gender segregation too. Taiwanese children attended what were called common schools, ogakko. These were distinct in curriculum, funding, facilities from the elementary schools, or shogakko, which were designated for Japanese children living in Taiwan.
So a two-tiered system.
Essentially, yes. And Aboriginal children were marginalized even further, often having their own separate, usually inferior educational systems. Critically, Taiwanese boys, while still facing segregation, generally had far more post-primary educational options available to them than Taiwanese girls did.
What was education like for girls before the Japanese arrived?
Before Japanese rule, education for elite girls was mostly homeschooling, focused on traditional virtues, literature, maybe some arts, or sometimes attendance at private study halls. Missionaries had actually established the first outside-the-home schools for girls, like Tamsui Girls Academy in 1884 and Jinlu Girls Academy in 1887.
But they weren't very popular.
They faced significant recruitment challenges. Many families were reluctant to send their daughters, partly because of the overt proselytizing nature of these missionary schools, but also because the missionaries firmly opposed deeply entrenched customs like foot binding and concubinage, which were still prevalent and accepted in many parts of society.
So given these initial conditions and the colonial objectives, how did the government's approach to girls' education evolve over its 50 years of rule? Did it become more inclusive over time, or did the segregation and that good wife, wise mother ideal just kind of adapt?
It evolved in distinct stages, reflecting shifting imperial priorities, internal needs within the colony, and sometimes responses to external pressures as well. In 1897, the very first girls' branch school was established as part of the National Language School. Initially, it focused mainly on Japanese language instruction and practical handicrafts like embroidery.
Skills for marriage, basically.
Elite Taiwanese families, always keen on enhancing their daughters' dowries and social standing, saw value in these skills, which probably helped with early enrollment. By 1898, this institution transformed into the third attached school. It introduced a more detailed guideline aimed at cultivating virtues, home economics, and childcare. The curriculum broadened to include subjects like Japanese, arithmetic, singing, and more advanced sewing, alongside handicrafts. So it moved beyond basic literacy towards a more comprehensive domestic education.
But then things changed.
Yes. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 prompted a significant reconsideration of the good wife, wise mother ideology within Japan itself. The war highlighted the economic problem of supporting war widows and orphans. It suggested women might actually need to work publicly to support their families.
Practical realities intruding.
Exactly. This, combined with an increase in highly educated women taking on new jobs in Japan, led to Japanese girls in Taiwan receiving more educational opportunities earlier than their Taiwanese counterparts. By 1906, reflecting this shift, the second attached school for Taiwanese girls actually abolished its primary education curriculum, transferring those students to the regular common schools.
So what did it focus on then?
It sharply focused on specific vocational training. It established teacher training programs. There was a rigorous 3-year shahanka and a 2-year fast-track shahansu kuseika alongside handicraft training, known as gikeika.
Why teachers specifically?
The explicit aim was to produce a cadre of female teachers. The thinking was this would encourage greater girls' enrollment in the common schools because parents might be more comfortable sending daughters to schools with female teachers. But it also served to ensure that women's professional roles, even in education, maintained traditional notions of propriety teaching, was seen as a suitable, nurturing profession within a gender-segregated field.
Interesting. And later on, after World War I.
Right. Following World War I, in a global climate influenced by Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination and rising mass movements for greater rights, the colonial government promulgated new ordinances on education in 1919 and 1922. These were largely aimed at projecting an image of equal opportunities for all Japanese subjects, including those in the colonies.
More PR than reality.
To some extent, yes. The 1919 ordinance replaced the old national language school system with higher common schools for both girls and boys. It emphasized creating loyal and good subjects who spoke Japanese, adhered to imperial morals, and were physically strong. The subsequent 1922 integration ordinance theoretically desegregated schools. However, in reality, it maintained a stratified system. Significantly fewer Taiwanese students were admitted to post-primary institutions compared to Japanese students. So while the policies appeared to evolve towards integration and equality on paper, the underlying ethnic and class divisions in educational access and opportunity persisted, really reinforcing colonial hierarchies rather than dismantling them.
So it's clear the colonial government had this very specific ideal for Taiwanese women: loyal subject, good wife, wise mother. But did Taiwanese women actually conform to this ideal that was being imposed? Or did they find ways to carve out their own paths, maybe use education for different purposes, perhaps even challenging the colonial agenda in subtle ways?
This is where we see a fascinating and crucial disjuncture, as some scholars put it, between the ideal colonial womanhood promoted by the state and the actual experiences, motivations, and outcomes for female students.
How so?
Well, first, family support and financial status were absolutely paramount in even accessing this secondary education. Elite and upper-middle-class Taiwanese families often sent their daughters to school for reasons of social status, maybe to secure better marriage prospects, or sometimes because male relatives who had themselves received a Japanese education actively encouraged it, seeing the benefits of modernization.
It wasn't cheap.
No, financial capacity was a huge barrier. Tuition fees and mandatory dormitory residence were expensive. There's one historical account noting that a student named Lin Kaisunu's monthly allowance during her schooling was equivalent to a police officer's entire monthly salary. That really highlights that secondary education was largely accessible only to the more affluent segments of Taiwanese society.
Okay, so it was mostly elites, but what about their motivations? Were they just aiming for domesticity?
Despite the official ideal of domesticity, there's actually ample evidence of significant self-motivation and career aspirations among these young women. Yamamoto Reiko's 1993 survey, for instance, found that a striking 82.7% of girls higher school graduates reported being primarily self-motivated to pursue secondary education, and many actively chose to become professionals afterwards.
So the schools weren't just finishing schools.
Not at all. They opened up new avenues. And while the dormitory strictly enforced discipline covering everything from proper Japanese eating etiquette to curfews and bans on outside food, all aimed at producing proper Japanese subjects, they also became vital spaces where students developed robust social networks, went to movies together, shopped with friends. They were forging new identities and communities beyond the confines of their families.
And did they pursue higher education?
Yes. Furthermore, many ambitious women figures like Lin Kaiwan, Chen Shiman, Lin Zhuangjichun are often cited pursued higher education, but they usually had to go abroad to Japan to do it.
Why Japan?
They sought specialized training in fields like pharmacy or ophthalmology, which was a necessity because Taiwan's own professional schools and the Taihoku Imperial University did not admit girls at that time. This strong desire for advanced education and professional careers vividly demonstrates an agency that stretched far beyond the confines of the prescribed good wife, wise mother ideal.
And the Japanese language skills they gained were useful.
Incredibly useful, not just for careers. Think of pharmacists needing to communicate with doctors, many of whom still wrote prescriptions in Japanese even after the colonial period. But it also sometimes facilitated marriages between different ethnic groups in Taiwan, bridging cultural divides through a shared imposed language.
Were there women who actively pushed back against the ideal?
Absolutely. Some women actively defied or significantly modified the prescribed ideal in their lives. You have figures like Qiu Yanyang, who was a dedicated teacher heavily involved in community service. She apparently readily admitted she wasn't very good at household work and actively encouraged her own daughters to be like boys, emphasizing strength and independence over traditional domesticity.
That's quite progressive for the time.
It really is. Or Yi Zimei, who was a nurse. She explicitly prioritized her work and career, only marrying at the relatively advanced age of 38 after considerable persuasion, and apparently on the firm condition that she could continue her nursing profession. Even someone like Lin Kaisunu, who did conform to some expectations by leaving teaching upon marriage, quickly opened a free knitting class for the poor in her community. This demonstrates a continued commitment to public service and community engagement, rather than simply retreating into purely domestic life.
So it's a rich tapestry then.
Exactly. A rich tapestry of Taiwanese women navigating, adapting, and sometimes reshaping the colonial ideal to align with their own ambitions, circumstances, and definitions of a meaningful life. It wasn't passive acceptance.
That's a powerful account of agency and adaptation within a constrained system. Okay, so moving forward in time. After the Japanese left in 1945, a new era began, one that promised liberation, self-determination, but initially, it seems, brought immense chaos and hardship for Taiwan. The transition was anything but smooth, marking a really dramatic shift from that structured, albeit exploitative colonial period.
This period, immediately following World War II, is absolutely critical because it profoundly challenges that common narrative of a seamless Taiwan miracle, emerging almost organically. The island was, in fact, on the very brink of economic collapse. And without significant external intervention, it's highly likely it would have completely unraveled. This external intervention played an undeniable, truly transformative role in preventing a complete meltdown and setting Taiwan on a new and, frankly, unexpected course.
So when the Kuomintang, the KMT government, arrived from the mainland after losing the Civil War, it wasn't a smooth transition for Taiwan's economy at all, was it? It sounds like it brought more immediate problems than solutions, initially at least.
Oh, it was far from smooth. In fact, it triggered a period of severe hyperinflation and rampant corruption that devastated the existing economic fabric. The KMT's arrival was accompanied by soldiers and officials who, by many accounts, systematically looted Taiwan's resources and infrastructure.
Looted? How?
Precious assets like the Zuho copper and gold mines were stripped of their equipment. Even railway equipment was reportedly taken, dismantled, and shipped off to support their ongoing and ultimately failing civil war effort against the communists on the mainland. This wholesale extraction, coupled with the influx of vast amounts of mainland currency, which quickly became worthless, caused massive demand pull inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. It led to severe rice shortages across the island after 1945.
So the basic necessities vanished.
Pretty much. Taiwan, despite its inherited Japanese infrastructure and productive capacity, was rapidly becoming what can only be described as a near-failed state in those first few years under KMT rule.
That sounds absolutely devastating for ordinary people. I was struck by an account I encountered, pieced together from family letters, about a woman named Mrs. Lin, who ran a small fabric shop in Taipei during this tumultuous period, the late 1940s. It just paints a picture of pure economic chaos.
I can imagine.
After the KMT arrived, hyperinflation took hold with terrifying speed. Mrs. Lin would sell a bolt of cloth in the morning, meticulously calculating her prices. But by the time she went to the wholesaler in the afternoon to restock, the cash in her hand could barely buy half of what she'd sold just hours earlier.
Worthless money.
Exactly. Her meticulously accumulated savings, painstakingly built up over years of hard work under the relatively stable, if oppressive, Japanese system, just evaporated into worthless paper almost overnight. The dream of expanding her modest shop, obliterated. Replaced by the daily, frantic struggle to simply tread water to survive. She apparently started demanding payment in rice or sweet potatoes instead of the rapidly depreciating currency just to have something tangible.
Mrs. Lin's experience vividly illustrates the widespread economic chaos and the brutal reality for ordinary people. Her story wasn't unique. Countless individuals saw their life savings vanish as the currency became worthless almost by the hour. This period saw Taiwan spiral towards being a near-failed state.
But didn't the KMT inherit a lot from the Japanese infrastructure industries?
They did. That's the irony. The KMT inherited a robust state structure and significant economic assets from the Japanese, including nearly 500 major heavy industries and almost 500 minor light industries. They immediately nationalized these, making them state-owned enterprises.
So they had assets.
They had assets, yes. But their mismanagement, the rampant corruption, and the immense burden of the ongoing Chinese Civil War entirely overshadowed these assets. The inherited foundations were indeed there, but the initial KMT rule was characterized by a catastrophic economic decline, turning valuable assets into liabilities through corruption and desperate resource stripping to fuel the war effort.
So after this period of incredible instability, near collapse, what finally pulled Taiwan back from the brink? Was it some internal KMT genius, a sudden, brilliant economic strategy emerging from within, or was it something else entirely that saved the day and set the stage for future growth?
Here's where it gets really interesting and where the conventional narrative of Taiwan's economic miracle needs serious reevaluation. The historical record points overwhelmingly to the pivotal role of United States economic aid, and crucially, the conditions attached to that aid, as the primary stabilizer and catalyst for reform.
U.S. aid.
Without it, Taiwan's trajectory would have been dramatically different, likely far less stable, far less prosperous. It was absolutely fundamental.
Why did the U.S. step in so heavily?
The geopolitical imperative for the U.S. became undeniable, especially after the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950. That fundamentally reshaped Washington's strategic priorities in Asia. Taiwan suddenly became a crucial strategic outpost in the broader Cold War context.
The unsinkable aircraft carrier.
Something like that. It was seen as essential for countering Soviet, Chinese communist influence and foreign aid initiatives, particularly during the mid-1950s. The U.S. viewed maintaining the government of the Republic of China's GRC forces on Taiwan as absolutely essential for its entire strategic position in the Far East and for its own national security interests, despite the GRC's increasingly unrealistic aspirations to retake the mainland.
So it was strategic, not purely economic generosity.
Primarily strategic. This led to a massive aid infusion. The U.S. committed around $1.4 billion between 1950 and 1965. Now, that might not sound like a huge number today, but at the time, it was an amount that seemed disproportionate for Taiwan's small size and population.
A lot of money back then.
A huge amount. By 1956, estimates projected maybe $325 million annually through 1960. This aid was explicitly the major source of disposable funding for the KMT government. It critically filled the severe gaps between meager domestic savings and massive investment needs, and also between export earnings and essential import requirements. It was, quite literally, a lifeline keeping the economy afloat.
But you mentioned strings attached.
Yes, and this is key. This aid came with non-negotiable strings attached. American advisors had unprecedented access and influence within the KMT government, and they effectively compelled the KMT to implement crucial financial reforms that the KMT itself was initially quite reluctant to embrace.
Like tackling inflation.
Exactly. Remember Mrs. Lin's story of hyperinflation. Her struggle finally ends, or at least eases, when the currency stabilizes under this intense U.S. pressure. American advisors push hard for fiscal responsibility, new currency reforms, balanced budgets, allowing people to finally breathe again as some economic predictability returned. This was a painful but absolutely necessary transition, essentially forced by this high-stakes intervention.
So the U.S. was deeply involved in policy.
Deeply involved. Furthermore, the U.S. aid agency became heavily involved in allocative decisions, deciding where the money went and in auditing how it was spent.
Yeah.
Even more so, arguably, than in South Korea during the same period.
Yeah.
They effectively pushed the KMT to adopt policies specifically designed to strengthen the Taiwan economy and, crucially, to actively promote the private sector, rather than sticking to the KMT's traditional preference for a state-centric, state-owned enterprise model.
And land reform, that was huge too, wasn't it?
Absolutely critical. The Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, or JCRR, which was heavily funded and influenced by the U.S., had personnel who were absolutely instrumental in driving the critical land reform initiatives in the early 1950s. They also helped rebuild devastated rural infrastructure and significantly increase agricultural productivity. This wasn't just about economics. It was a deeply strategic redistributive reform. Assigning property rights directly to the land tillers not only boosted production incentives,
but it also undercut the old landlord class.
Exactly. It had the crucial political effect of insulating the KMT regime from the powerful, potentially rebellious traditional landlord class, creating a base of support among the newly empowered small farmers.
It's important, though, to understand the KMT's own internal challenges and how their policies shifted during this period, too, right? It wasn't just the U.S. acting upon them.
No, absolutely. You have to consider their situation. The GRC arrived in Taiwan, burdened with this massive army, maybe 500,000 men, plus around 1.5 million refugees from the mainland. This placed a tremendous burden, as analysts called it, on Taiwan's relatively small economy and its limited resources.
Maintaining that army must have been expensive.
Hugely expensive. And maintaining this massive military force, always with its primary objective being the fantastical idea of retaking the mainland, was consistently beyond Taiwan's own economic capacity. It meant that military problems often took priority over genuine, long-term economic development planning for Taiwan itself. The GRC, for instance, was expending something like 10% of its entire gross national product just on the military.
And their initial approach to the economy wasn't exactly pro-growth.
Initially, no. The GRC had not participated enthusiastically in the economic development of Taiwan, according to some sources. They showed a strong disposition toward government ownership and state monopolies, consistent with traditional Sun Yat-sen-inspired nationalist ideology. There was a 4-year economic development plan formulated in 1952, largely under U.S. encouragement, but it reportedly had little substantive value initially, due to a profound lack of central government support and real commitment. They were focused elsewhere.
And the economy was still fragile.
Very fragile. Taiwan faced increasing budgetary deficits and was highly vulnerable to inflation, even into the mid-50s. There was a 14% price index increase in 1955 compared to 1954. The government largely seemed to operate on the assumption that these deficits could simply be met by more U.S. aid or through inflationary deficit financing, essentially printing money.
Risky strategy.
Very. However, as Taiwan's economy began to slowly recover by 1955, the KMT, under that persistent pressure from U.S. advisors, did start to implement import substitution industrialization ISI policies. These focused on developing domestic production of non-durable consumer goods like chemical fertilizer, plastics, textiles, things that had previously been largely imported.
How did they support these new industries?
Through the usual ISI toolkit, high tariffs to protect them from foreign competition, allocations of scarce hard currencies, mostly from U.S. aid, to import necessary machinery and raw materials, and targeted loans, often channeled through state-controlled banks.
But there was also some internal discipline within the KMT.
Yes, and this is important too. The traumatic lessons learned from their catastrophic defeat on the mainland did seem to instill in the KMT leadership a deep-seated belief in the importance of fiscal and monetary conservatism, avoiding hyperinflation at all costs, and also a commitment to separating the economic technocrats from the political elites, giving the experts some space to work.
Learning from past mistakes.
Exactly. This self-imposed discipline, born from a truly traumatic historical experience, proved vital in making the U.S. aid and the externally imposed reforms ultimately effective. There was a foundation of sorts for the U.S. advice to build upon, even if it took pressure to get things moving.
So, what does all this mean for that standard economic miracle narrative that so many of us have grown up hearing about Taiwan? It sounds far less miraculous and much more like, well, a result of forced pragmatism, almost a reluctant recovery compelled by massive external forces.
This really raises the core question. Can we truly attribute Taiwan's post-war success solely to an internally generated miracle or brilliant KMT technocratic planning alone? A narrative, by the way, often championed by the KMT itself for decades.
Right.
The evidence strongly suggests it was actually born from a near-failed state, teetering on the edge of complete collapse, which was then propped up by massive conditional U.S. aid that literally compelled the KMT to adopt crucial reforms. It was initially unwilling, or perhaps simply unable, to embrace on its own. It was a victory, first and foremost, for economic stabilization and the establishment of a functional market economy. Arguably, it was declared, perhaps somewhat disingenuously, as one scholar put it, by the U.S. as a major triumph for capitalism over communism in the intense Cold War ideological battle, rather than being a purely organic, internally generated miracle. This profoundly challenges the simplistic narrative often presented, revealing a much more complex, much more externally driven genesis for Taiwan's later economic trajectory.
We've covered so much ground today, from the, unexpected liberation brought by sugarcane right up to the critical lifeline of U.S. aid that essentially saved an economy on the very brink of collapse. What really emerges is a picture far more nuanced, far more complex than the simple narratives often suggest. Given all these complexities, how do Taiwanese people themselves remember and interpret these different eras today? It's clearly not a monolithic, unified view, is it?
Not at all. And when you connect this to the bigger picture today, you find that the memory and interpretation of Taiwan's colonial past and its post-war development under the KMT are highly contested and often deeply politicized. This dynamic really reflects the island's unique and ongoing identity challenges, where historical narratives are frequently shaped and reshaped by contemporary political needs and debates. This isn't just academic history, it's living history that continues to shape current views and political discourse on the island.
It's particularly striking, I think, that there seems to be this strong sentiment among many Taiwanese, particularly older generations perhaps, that Japanese rule, despite its colonial nature, was in some ways preferable to the initial chaotic years of Kuomintang governance. That's a powerful and, for many outside observers, a really counterintuitive observation.
That's a widely cited sentiment, yeah. It's often encapsulated in that very pointed colloquial phrase, "The dog days are over, we are in a pig pen now." Kukuzulai, the dog and the pig.
In this saying, the dog refers to the Japanese implying perhaps a harsh, strict, but ultimately predictable and efficient master. And the pig refers to the KMT representing, in this view, a greedy, corrupt, and chaotic regime, at least in those early years. Many older Taiwanese who lived through both periods remember Japanese rule for its significant infrastructure development, the railroads that crisscross the island, the modern hospitals, the expansion of schools, even the foundations of what is now National Taiwan University.
A sense of order. Yes, they also often recall a period of strong law and order. People mention not feeling the need to lock their doors, a sense of personal safety being largely assured. This led to a perception, for some, of an improved quality of life and genuine modernization efforts. Japan did deliberately invest in developing Taiwan as its model colony, which did set it apart somewhat from its other, often more brutally extractive, colonial endeavors in Asia.
But the KMT arrival was seen very differently.
In stark contrast, yes. The initial years of KMT rule were perceived very negatively by many local Taiwanese. KMT soldiers, upon arrival, were widely seen as looting Taiwan's resources, dismantling public services. We mentioned the accounts of them stripping mining equipment from places like the Zuho mines, taking railway components, selling them as scrap metal, likely to fund their failing civil war effort.
And the inflation.
That, coupled with the severe hyperinflation and rampant corruption, devastated the local economy. Then, of course, you have the truly traumatic 228 incident in 1947, a brutal crackdown on popular unrest that resulted in thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of deaths. And the subsequent White Terror, a long period of martial law and intense political repression that extended right into the late 1980s. These events further cemented profoundly negative views of KMT brutality and authoritarianism for a huge segment of the population. The KMT was often seen, especially in those early years, as a corrupted wartime regime that brought more arbitrary violence and unwritten rules compared to the predictable, albeit often harsh, legal framework of the Japanese.
But you have to add nuance here too, right? It wasn't universally positive under Japan.
Absolutely crucial nuance. While some older Taiwanese, particularly perhaps Han elites or middle class, do remember aspects of Japanese rule fondly, this was absolutely not a universal experience. Elite and upper-middle-class Taiwanese often receive better treatment, more educational and economic opportunities, aligning somewhat with the colonial administration's needs for intermediaries and skilled labor.
But not everyone benefited.
Far from it. Indigenous peoples in particular faced immense persecution and violence under Japanese rule. This included forced assimilation policies, confiscation of traditional lands, and often brutal military pacification campaigns. Their experiences are frequently overlooked or minimized in mainstream narratives that tend to focus on the Han Taiwanese experience. So the memory is deeply segmented by ethnicity and social class. It's not one single story.
We also touched on how U.S. aid complicated the economic miracle narrative attributed to the KMT. But some also argue that the scale of the KMT's own economic achievements, maybe later on, is sometimes overstated when compared to the foundations laid during the Japanese era, suggesting the KMT essentially built on, or maybe just benefited from, existing foundations rather than creating something entirely new from scratch.
Yeah.
How do these viewpoints contend with each other?
This is a really robust area of debate among historians and economists looking at Taiwan. Some argue, sometimes quite strongly, that Japan actually left Taiwan as an economic basket case in 1945, emphasizing wartime destruction, high poverty rates, and maybe a mismanaged agricultural sector, implying the KMT had to rebuild from a very low base.
Giving the KMT more credit.
Exactly. This view highlights the KMT's subsequent contributions, particularly the comprehensive land reforms implemented in the 1950s reforms that, as we discussed, are widely credited with massively spiking agricultural productivity and, crucially, freeing up surplus labor that could then move into the burgeoning industrial sector. These policies, they argue, set the stage for the later Taiwan miracle of the 1970s and 1980s, which saw far more explosive growth than anything achieved under Japanese rule, pushing Taiwan into the ranks of newly industrialized economies. This narrative often emphasizes the KMT's technocratic competence and planning, especially once it finally committed to developing Taiwan for its own sake after the dream of retaking the mainland faded.
But the counter-argument.
The counter-argument, which we've also explored, posits that the narrative of the KMT's miracle is significantly challenged by the undeniable fact that many of these crucial early reforms, including land reforms and the initial vital shift towards a more market-oriented, private sector-led economy, were often heavily influenced, if not outright compelled, by massive U.S. aid and persistent external technocratic advice.
So not purely internal genius.
Right. It wasn't necessarily originating solely from the KMT's internal vision or brilliant strategy. It becomes a debate about endogenous versus exogenous drivers of growth. How much credit do you give to the KMT's internal policies and capabilities versus the external pressures and resources provided by the United States, particularly in those critical early decades? The truth, as always, likely lies in a complex interaction of both internal factors and external forces.
It's really clear that these historical interpretations aren't just dry academic discussions. They play a significant, active role in contemporary Taiwanese identity and politics. They shape how the island views itself, its past, and its relationship with others, particularly, of course, mainland China.
That's absolutely true. If you connect this to the bigger picture today, contemporary Taiwanese nationalism often finds it useful to credit Imperial Japan and, later, the United States for significant aspects of Taiwan's modernization. This is done, sometimes quite deliberately, to downplay modernization progress and legitimacy of the KMT Chinese colonial regime, as some analyses put it. It's a form of historical reinterpretation serving present political goals.
Why that emphasis?
This stance is often driven by a powerful desire to decolonize and depart from Chinese nationalism ideology, the ideology brought over by the KMT, and to strongly differentiate Taiwan as a distinct entity, historically and politically, from mainland China. The fond memories of Japanese rule, for many, become a tool in this process. They're often a relative comparison, where Japan's predictable, though frequently harsh rule is framed as less bad than the chaotic, corrupt, and brutal initial KMT years. It's not necessarily a full endorsement of colonialism itself, but rather a reflection of a perceived stability and progress contrasted against a period of severe decline and repression.
So memory is political.
Deeply political. And it's vital always to acknowledge that historical memory in Taiwan is highly segregated. Different ethnic groups, Han versus Aboriginals, for example, and different social classes, had vastly different experiences under both regimes. This leads to widely varied historical memories that continue to shape their perspectives today. There's simply no single, universally accepted historical narrative, but rather a complex, often contested mosaic of experiences and interpretations.
This deep dive into Taiwan's economic history really reveals that what often seems like a straightforward story, miracle, or exploitation is anything but. From the unexpected liberation brought by something like sugarcane reshaping social customs, to the critical lifeline of U.S. aid saving an economy truly on the brink of collapse, and then these contrasting, often politically charged, memories of colonial and post-colonial rule. Taiwan's path to prosperity was clearly forged through a fascinating, often surprising interplay of global economic forces, profound social shifts, and incredibly complex international politics. It's really testament to the unforeseen ways history unfolds.
Absolutely. We see just how powerful underlying economic incentives can be in driving monumental societal changes, sometimes more effectively than overt policy. We've seen how intense external geopolitical pressures can force crucial, sometimes otherwise unpopular, reforms. And we've seen how historical memory is not static, but is continually shaped and reshaped by lived experiences and, importantly, by contemporary political contexts and needs. The Taiwanese economic miracle, if we can even call it that without heavy qualification, certainly wasn't a singular, simple event. It was a complex, multi-layered transformation, reminding us all that the real forces shaping history are very rarely what we initially think them to be.